Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. I got 3 questions. Jump right in. Still gonna keep saying that. Why do some animals undergo metamorphosis? Oh, that's a fun question. Metamorphosis is useful in animals where different phases of their lives call for different adaptations in order to deal with their surroundings. The most common would be in insects. Whenever people think of a metamorphic animal, that's usually what they think of. Other arthropods also have more subtle metamorphoses, like for example the plankton stage of different crustaceans like crabs and lobsters. But let's just focus on insects right now because it would cover the crustacean adaptations as well, but in a much more varied and obvious kind of way. Let's actually look at the 3 stages of development for an insect. An insect that is holometabolous, that is to say it goes through a complete metamorphosis. You've got 3 stages. You've got larva, pupa, and adult. And those 3 stages all have different purposes, if you think about it. The adult stage is really just the reproductive stage. Many insects don't even eat when they're adults. Not all. There's plenty that have long adult lives, but a lot of them don't. Their chief goal whenever they reach adulthood is to find a mate. Well, how do they do that? How do they find a mate generally? Well, most adult insects have wings. That really helps with, finding the right partner to create a genetic legacy with, especially when you're tiny, like an insect. So why don't we just have larvae like that? Not a single juvenile insect has wings. None. And it makes good sense because I'm sure that most of you have probably experienced this. You've seen an insect with kind of a messed up wing. Wings are very fragile, delicate, and complicated organs, and so if every time an animal grew and molted they had to create wings, they would actually severely limit their ability to survive because something could go wrong. It would be a lot easier for something to be damaged there. And that's why animals that just continue to grow indefinitely, like arachnids, some arachnids, that's one of the reasons why arachnids don't have wings. There's kind of an internet joke about that, like when spiders grow wings, well, they're never going to do that because it's actually very inefficient given their sort of indeterminate kind of lifespan. Whereas with insects, they molt, their terminal molt, their last venture into what we would consider adulthood, that's when they have wings, and that's only when they have wings. Even with hemimetabolous insects like grasshoppers, they don't have wings until the very last molt, the very last stage of their lifespan. So it makes sense because if they had to replace their wings every time they grew, there'd be a lot of room for error, a lot of room for damage, and it would probably end up being a problem. It's a detriment, in other words, if they had to just keep doing that. Now let's look at the larva. Like, what's the purpose of a larva or a juvenile, if we're talking hemimetabolous? To grow as fast as possible. So in some ways you could say that an adult insect is sort of like a reproductive system with some add-ons, and a larval insect is a digestive system with some add-ons. That's kind of how they function. And that makes good sense. If they were born grown or born big, it would take a lot of calories for the mother to produce those offspring, and ultimately she could only produce a few. And then if they got eaten by a predator, that'd just be the end of that bloodline. So it makes sense to create a lot of tiny offspring who have the ability to eat a lot of material and grow really fast. And you especially see that there's no animal that exemplifies that better than a caterpillar. A caterpillar is just a stomach with legs, and that's what they exist for. They have a soft body, they have a big gut, they just exist to grow, and they put that all those calories away in order to become their reproductive form, which is the adult form. And then the pupa in between is just a transitory system. It's so that they can make that dramatic change. And again, you're going from an animal that's pretty simple, a caterpillar, it's just like a tube with legs, to something more complicated, something that has wings in order to find a mate. Well, you don't want to have any room for error there. You don't want to mess that up. So they only make wings once, and they have a really interesting little transitory period where all those dramatic changes can take place, and that's the pupal stage. So it makes good sense when you're an animal that has a lot of predators, that has a low chance of survival, to sort of divide that lifespan into little increments where they specialize in growth and then they specialize in reproduction after that. Whereas with a human, a human child and an adult human, they're not physiologically that different. I mean, there's just proportions and there's very little difference compared to, say, a caterpillar and a butterfly. And that makes good sense, given that humans are investor animals. The likelihood of a baby surviving to adulthood to reproduce, it's a lot higher than a caterpillar. So that's the logic there. That's one of the chief reasons why some animals metamorphose. There's always, in nature, you're always going to see something that's advantageous, generally speaking. And if it's not, at some point it's going to get corrected. And since metamorphosis is so common in insects, it's pretty safe to say that it's a very useful system, and for all the reasons that I've described. Let's see. Second question: what is a dissociative? That's kind of a funnier question because not funny, but it's harder to answer because the definitions have changed lately. Let me just go into the four, put that in air quotes, 4 types of drugs, okay? And what they do is they have to do with the way the brain works. So there are stimulants: caffeine, nicotine, amphetamine, pretty much anything with ends with "ene." Those are things that speed up brain activity, speed up the transmitter activity. And those are noticeably described subjectively as something that sort of speeds up your reaction time, speeds up your thoughts, can create anxious scenarios, things like that. Anything that speeds a person up, that's a stimulant. Then you've got a depressant. Depressant slows brain activity. It slows the processes. Alcohol. I'm trying to think of some other depressants. That's the one that I immediately. Oh, cannabis. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Anything that slows a person down. What's that one called? That trank. Ketamine. Things like that. Those slow people down. Xanax. Those. If someone is anxious, those tend to calm them down, and if they're already calm, sometimes it can produce anxious effects, but generally speaking, it slows down the brain. It slows down the brain activity. And then you've got hallucinogens. They change the way a person perceives reality, which is why they're called hallucinogens, because a hallucination is a perception that's not objectively verified by other people, right? So you see a pink elephant and nobody else does, it's probably not really there, at least according to the scientific method. So yeah, that's what a hallucinogen is. Well, then there's dissociatives, and this is why I said it's kind of a harder question to answer, because when I was a kid, we were taught that dissociatives were a separate category, and there were 4 kinds of drugs. And the dissociatives changed a person's perception of themselves. So it's more like they were watching themselves do things rather than experiencing things directly. Well, lately, I don't know when this got established, but a lot of people, because they consider it to be a change in perception, consider dissociatives to be a subclass of hallucinogens. So, I don't know. Like, maybe I'm biased. I think it should be a 4th category, but I think that could just be because that's what I was taught when I was a kid, so I don't know. Maybe that's the only reason why I'm attached to the idea of a dissociative being a separate category. Maybe they really should qualify as a hallucinogen. That being said, that's what dissociatives do. I'm trying to think, what's that thing they call lean? Promethazine cough syrup. That's a well-known dissociative. It makes a person feel more like they're watching themselves do things rather than actively engaging in any kind of activities. So I hope that answers that. That's really what a dissociative is. Your perception of the external world hasn't changed. Your perception of how you perceive the world has changed. Kind of getting a little meta there. Last question: is love just a chemical? Yeah, I would say so, but it's funny. People love to say that in like a cynical way, but everything's a chemical. Everything's a reaction. That doesn't negate it. It doesn't mean that. I hear that so often. Happiness is just dopamine and serotonin, and love is just oxytocin. So what? I'm not saying that you're implying that, but the phrase "just a chemical." Everything's a chemical. That doesn't negate it, doesn't make it less of what it is. Happiness is still real, even if it's a chemical. Love is still real, even if it's a chemical. So, yeah, incidentally, just a sec. Got something in my frame. Oh, there it is. I fixed it, sorry. But yeah, most things that we experience because our brain is perceiving reality around us, and that's a series of electrochemical signals. Doesn't make it not real. It could also make everything not real. So it's kind of funny, somebody says love is just a chemical, happiness is just a chemical. Well, so is sadness, so is fear, and so is that mountain that you can see. If you're seeing a mountain, what you're actually seeing is a series of electrochemicals taking place in your brain telling you there's a mountain. Doesn't mean the mountain's not real. And if the mountain isn't real, well, then we've got bigger questions to tackle other than the nature of happiness and love and sadness and things like that. So, yeah, it's a chemical, but, I mean, even how you came to that conclusion, when somebody says, that's the funniest thing to me, when someone says, well, love is just a chemical, happiness is just a chemical, etc., any of those line of phrasing, your conclusion that you drew is also a chemical, or a series of chemicals would be a better way of explaining it. Like, you thought about it, you gauged it based on information that you were told, and then you reached a conclusion. All that was a chemical. All that was a series of chemical reactions, a series of neurotransmitters, a series of neurons linking up to one another. So, yeah, everything's chemical in that sense. Everything is material in that sense. Doesn't make it less valid. So, yeah, I hope that covers it. Thanks, everybody. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.